The crystal chandeliers of the Golden Heron cast a fragmented, shimmering light across the pristine white tablecloths, creating an atmosphere that was designed to intimidate as much as it was to welcome. For Minho, a man whose reputation in the city's underbelly was whispered with a mixture of reverence and terror, this opulence was nothing more than a stage set. He sat in a high-backed leather booth near the back of the restaurant, his posture rigid, his dark suit tailored to perfection, concealing the tattoos that marked his allegiance and his history. He checked his watch, a heavy platinum piece that cost more than most people earned in a year, and his jaw tightened. He knew exactly what this was. His lieutenants, a group of ambitious young men who mistook cruelty for strength, had organized this lunch under the guise of expanding social horizons, but Minho knew the truth. It was a test, a prank, a way to see if the stoic boss would crack when presented with a situation they deemed humiliating. They were watching from the bar area, their laughter barely suppressed behind crystal tumblers of whiskey, waiting for the woman they had selected to walk through the doors. They expected him to be angry, to storm out, or perhaps to mock the date to maintain his hard-edged persona. Minho took a sip of water, his eyes scanning the entrance. He had spent a lifetime reading people, predicting their movements before they made them, and he was tired. He was tired of the posturing, tired of the violence, and tired of the shallow loyalty of men who only followed him out of fear. He expected a woman who was perhaps loud, or someone they had paid to be obnoxious, someone designed to clash with the refined atmosphere of the French restaurant. The heavy oak doors swung open, and the hush that fell over the front of the house was palpable. It wasn't the silence of awe that usually accompanied a celebrity. It was the judgmental silence of the elite assessing an outsider. Standing there, clutching a modest purse with white-knuckled tension, was Jasmine. She was not the caricature his men had likely promised. She was a slightly plus-sized African-American woman, wearing a simple, beige dress that fell to her knees. It was a dress bought from a department store rack, sensible and neat, but it looked like burlap next to the silk and satin of the other patrons. She hesitated at the maitre d's podium, her eyes wide and darting around the room like a deer that had wandered into a wolf's den. From his vantage point, Minho saw not just her appearance, but her spirit. He saw the way she smoothed the fabric of her dress, a nervous tic that betrayed her terrifying anxiety. He saw the way she took a deep breath, steeling herself against the invisible waves of judgment rolling off the nearby tables. His men at the bar were nudging each other, covering their mouths to hide their snickers. They saw a punchline. Minho saw a human being walking into a firing line. He felt a sudden, sharp spike of anger, not at the woman, but at the world that made her feel so small before she had even spoken a word. He watched as the maitre d', a man with a nose so upturned he seemed to be inspecting the ceiling, looked at her reservation name on his tablet with a sneer. Jasmine whispered something, pointing toward Minho's table. The maitre d' sighed, a theatrical gesture of long-suffering patience, and began to lead her through the maze of tables. Minho did not look away. He kept his gaze fixed on her, his face unreadable, waiting to see if she would run or if she would walk the gauntlet. As Jasmine navigated the space between the tables, she felt the weight of 100 eyes pressing against her skin. The restaurant smelled of expensive truffle oil and old money, a scent that made her feel nauseous with insecurity. She had almost canceled this date 3 times that morning. Her friends had told her she was crazy to accept a blind date at such a high-end place, especially one set up through a friend of a friend she barely knew. But there was a part of her, a small, hopeful ember buried deep beneath layers of self-doubt, that wanted to believe in fairy tales. She wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, she deserved a seat at the table. However, as she passed a table of socialites who fell silent and tracked her movement with critical gazes, that hope began to curdle into shame. She felt too large for the narrow gaps between the chairs. She felt the fabric of her beige dress pulling tight, and she imagined seams bursting, a nightmare scenario playing out in her head.
She spotted him then. Minho.
He was terrifyingly handsome, with sharp cheekbones and eyes that seemed to hold a darkness she couldn't quite place. He looked like a statue carved from obsidian and ice. Panic flared in her chest. This man was out of her league. He was out of her universe. She slowed her pace, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Surely there was a mistake. He was probably waiting for a model, someone tall and willowy who drank champagne for breakfast. Jasmine looked toward the exit, the instinct to flee nearly overwhelming her legs. But then, Min-ho did something that stopped the room. He stood up. In the world of fine dining, and in the world of the Mafia, respect was a currency, and standing for a guest was a sign of high honor. The snickering from the bar died down instantly. Min-ho buttoned his suit jacket with a fluid motion and waited, his eyes locking onto hers. He wasn't looking past her. He was looking at her. Jasmine forced her feet to move, each step feeling like she was wading through molasses. When she finally reached the table, she was breathless, not from exertion, but from the sheer emotional toll of the walk. "Hi," she managed to squeak out, her voice trembling.
I'm Jasmine.
"I think we're supposed to be having lunch." She braced herself for the rejection, for the look of disappointment, for the excuse that he had an emergency phone call. Instead, Min-ho nodded, a slight bow of his head that was culturally ingrained but deeply personal in this moment. "I am Min-ho," he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate through the table. "Please sit." He gestured to the chair opposite him. He didn't wait for the waiter to pull it out. He reached over and adjusted the chair for her himself. As she sat, she felt the plush leather swallow her, offering a momentary comfort. She risked a glance at him. "I almost didn't come in," she admitted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I feel a bit." Underdressed, Min-ho looked at her beige dress, then at the flashy, sequined gowns of the women at the next table. "Elegance is not about the fabric, Jasmine," he said quietly. "It is about the carriage. You hold yourself with more dignity than anyone else in this room." The arrival of the waiter broke the fragile bubble of connection that had started to form. He was a tall, thin man with slicked-back hair and an expression that suggested he had just smelled something unpleasant. He placed the menus on the table with a little more force than necessary, the leather covers slapping against the wood. He turned his body significantly toward Min-ho, effectively giving Jasmine his shoulder. "Good afternoon, sir," the waiter said, his voice dripping with sycophantic oil. "May I start you off with the wine list? We have an excellent vintage Pinot Noir that just arrived." He completely ignored Jasmine, treating her as if she were an empty chair. Min-ho didn't reach for the menu. He sat perfectly still, his eyes narrowing slightly. "My guest," Min-ho said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerously quiet, "has not been greeted." The waiter blinked, flustered, and turned halfway toward Jasmine, offering a tight, fake smile that didn't reach his eyes.
Yes."
"And for the lady." Jasmine felt the heat rising in her cheeks. She picked up the menu, trying to hide behind it. The prices were astronomical. A simple appetizer cost more than her weekly grocery budget. She scanned the list, her eyes blurring. I'll just have the garden salad, please," she whispered, trying to make herself as small and inexpensive as possible. The waiter let out a short, sharp breath, a scoff disguised as a cough. "A sensible choice," the waiter said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Perhaps with the dressing on the side? To keep it light." The implication hung in the air, heavy and toxic. He was mocking her weight, openly and cruelly, under the guise of service. Jasmine's grip on the menu tightened, her knuckles turning ashen. She wanted to disappear. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She looked down at her lap, blinking back the tears that were threatening to spill. "No," Min-ho said. The word cracked like a whip. The waiter froze. Min-ho slowly closed his menu and placed it on the table. "She will not have the salad. And she will not have the dressing on the side." He leaned forward, his dark eyes boring into the waiter's soul. "We will have the chef's tasting menu. The full 7 courses. With the wine pairing," the waiter stammered. "Sir, that is a very substantial amount of food." Min-ho's hand moved on the table, a subtle twitch that his enemies knew meant violence was imminent, though here it was restrained civility. Are you implying my guest cannot enjoy a meal? Or are you implying that your kitchen is incapable of serving us? The waiter went pale. No, sir. Of course not, sir. Min-ho held the waiter's gaze, his silence far more terrifying than any shout. Bring the wine list, Min-ho commanded, dismissing the man with a wave of his hand. As the waiter scurried away, his arrogance punctured by fear, the atmosphere at the table shifted. Jasmine let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 20 years. She looked at Min-ho, really looked at him, searching for the mockery she was used to finding in men's eyes. She found none. Instead, she found a strange, mirrored weariness. You didn't have to do that, she said softly, her hands unclenching from the napkin. I'm used to it. People like him. They just see what they want to see. Min-ho reached for his water glass, the crystal catching the ambient light. That is exactly why I had to do it, he replied. Disrespect flourishes in the dark. When you shine a light on it, it withers, he paused, looking at the scars on his knuckles, remnants of a life she couldn't possibly imagine. Besides, he added, his voice softening, I suspect you have fought enough battles alone. Tonight, you do not have to. The arrival of the first course brought with it a sensory shift that seemed to insulate them from the rest of the restaurant. The plates were works of art, delicate arrangements of scallop and foam that looked too beautiful to destroy with a fork. Jasmine hesitated, her insecurity flaring again as she looked at the array of silverware flanking her plate. She felt the familiar prickle of panic, the fear of using the wrong fork and confirming everyone's bias that she didn't belong. Min-ho, sensing her hesitation without looking up, picked up the outermost fork. He didn't make a show of it. He simply began to eat, signaling the correct path without a word of instruction. Jasmine followed his lead, the first bite melting on her tongue, a burst of flavor that was startlingly intense. As the meal progressed, the tension in her shoulders began to dissolve. They spoke, tentatively at first, about safe subjects: the weather, the city, the food. But the artificiality of small talk quickly eroded under the weight of the genuine curiosity they felt for one another. Jasmine found herself talking about her job as a pediatric nurse, about the children who didn't care what she looked like, only that her hands were gentle and her voice was kind. She spoke of the exhaustion of caring, of the emotional toll of holding space for others' pain while often having no one to hold hers. Min-ho listened with an intensity that was disarming. He was a man who was used to people talking at him, pleading, bargaining, lying, but rarely did anyone talk to him with such unvarnished honesty. He found himself sharing fragments of his own truth, carefully edited but emotionally resonant. He spoke of the burden of expectation, of being born into a life where weakness was a death sentence. I am surrounded by people, Min-ho said, tracing the rim of his wine glass, yet I have never felt more isolated than when I am in a room full of my friends. He glanced toward the bar, where his lieutenants were still watching, though their laughter had died down, replaced by confused whispering. They couldn't understand why their boss was engaging so deeply with the woman they had meant to be a punchline. We are both judged for our exteriors, Min-ho continued, his eyes returning to Jasmine. They see you and assume you are weak or undisciplined. They see me and assume I am a monster or a king. Neither of them bothers to check if there is a person breathing underneath. Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. It was the first time a man had ever equated his struggle with hers, validating her pain rather than dismissing it. It's heavy armor to wear, she whispered. It gets so heavy, Min-ho nodded slowly.
Yes.
But tonight, perhaps we can set it down. The spell of the evening was fragile, held together by the thin thread of their growing connection, and it was about to be shattered. From the bar area, Dae-young, the ringleader of the prank and Min-ho's second-in-command, watched with growing irritation. The joke was supposed to be over by now. Min-ho was supposed to have made an excuse and left, or, at the very least, he should be sitting there in stony silence, enduring the humiliation. Instead, he looked engaged. He looked
human.
This did not sit well with Dae-young, whose entire worldview relied on the hierarchy of dominance and superficial power. He downed the last of his whiskey, the amber liquid fueling his bravado, and slammed the glass onto the bar. He's losing it, Dae-young muttered to the others. He's actually entertaining her. It's embarrassing. He adjusted his silk tie, smoothed back his hair, and decided to intervene. He would force the issue. He would remind Minho of who he was and, more importantly, remind Jasmine of who she wasn't. Dae-young strode across the dining room floor, his gait arrogant and claiming space. The sound of his heavy footsteps approached their table like a gathering storm. Jasmine felt the shift in energy before she saw him. Minho's face, which had been open and relaxed, suddenly hardened into a mask of granite. Dae-young stopped right at the edge of their table, looming over Jasmine, ignoring her presence entirely to address Minho. "Boss," Dae-young said, his voice loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables. "We were getting worried. The boys and I thought you might need an extraction," he laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "We didn't realize you were running a charity event tonight." The cruelty of the words hung in the air, suspended in the silence of the restaurant. Jasmine froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. The blood drained from her face, leaving her ashen. The word charity echoed in her mind, confirming her worst fears, that this wasn't a date, it was a setup, a joke. She looked at Minho, her eyes wide with betrayal and humiliation, waiting for him to laugh, to join in, to reveal that he had been part of it all along. Minho did not look at Dae-young. He carefully placed his silverware on the plate, aligning them with precision. "Dae-young," Minho said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You are interrupting my dinner." Dae-young, emboldened by the audience of the restaurant and his own drunken confidence, didn't back down. He leaned in closer, a smirk playing on his lips. "Come on, Minho. Look at this. It's a gag, right? You can't seriously be sitting here with this." He gestured vaguely at Jasmine, a gesture of dismissal that reduced her to an object, an eyesore. "We set this up for a laugh. To see if you'd actually go through with it. Don't tell me you're actually enjoying the company of the whale." The slur hit Jasmine like a physical blow. She gasped, a small, wounded sound, and pushed her chair back, ready to flee. The tears she had held back earlier now spilled over, hot and stinging. She grabbed her purse, her hands shaking so badly she dropped her napkin on the floor. "Hey, I have to go," she stammered, her voice breaking. "I knew it. I knew I shouldn't have come." "Sit down, Jasmine." Minho's voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a command that froze everyone in a 20-foot radius. He wasn't speaking to her as a subordinate. He was speaking to her as a protector. He stood up then, rising slowly, unfolding his height until he towered over Dae-young. The restaurant had gone deathly silent. Even the kitchen staff had paused, peering through the service window. Minho turned his body to face his lieutenant, his eyes burning with a cold, white-hot fury that Dae-young had never seen before. "You speak of size," Minho began, his voice projecting clearly through the room, reaching every diner who had stared, every waiter who had sneered. "You look at this woman, and you see only volume. You see space occupied." He took a step closer to Dae-young, who involuntarily took a step back, the smirk faltering. "I have sat across from her for an hour. Do you know what I have seen?" Minho gestured to Jasmine, who was frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face. "I have seen a woman who carries the weight of the world with a grace you could never understand. I have seen a woman who faces judgment every single day, judgment from small, empty men like you, and yet she remains kind. She remains soft in a world that tries to harden her." Minho's voice cracked with emotion, a rare display of vulnerability that stunned the room. "You set this up as a joke? You thought it would be funny to put a beast with the boss." Minho laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You are right. There is a beast at this table. But it is not her." He pointed a finger at Dae-young's chest, poking the expensive silk suit. "It is the man who thinks humiliation is humor. It is the man who thinks beauty is a size." He looked around the room, making eye contact with the socialites and the businessmen who had judged Jasmine earlier. "She is the only real thing in this entire room. Her heart is vast. Yours, Dae-young. Yours is withered. It is microscopic. You are the small one here." Dae-young stood paralyzed, his face burning a deep crimson. The public dressing down dismantled his ego piece by piece. There was no comeback for moral superiority. The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer a silence of judgment directed at Jasmine. It was a silence of shame directed at Dae-young and everyone who had silently agreed with him. Min-ho turned his back on his lieutenant, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than dust. He turned to Jasmine, his expression softening instantly from rage to profound tenderness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, pristine and white, and offered it to her. "I apologize," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I apologize for the company I have kept. I apologize that you were brought here under false pretenses." Jasmine took the handkerchief, her hands still shaking. She looked up at him, and she saw tears in his eyes too. "But I am not sorry I met you," Min-ho continued. "In a life filled with lies, you are the most beautiful truth I have ever encountered." Jasmine dabbed at her eyes, her heart swelling with a mixture of pain and incredible relief. The waiter, the one who had been so cruel earlier, approached the table. He looked terrified, his hands wringing together.
"Sir."
"Madam," he stammered, his eyes fixed on the floor. The management would like to offer the meal on the house."
"And?"
"I am deeply sorry." Min-ho didn't even look at him. "We do not need your charity," Min-ho said, throwing a stack of bills onto the table, far more than the meal cost. "We are leaving." He extended his hand to Jasmine. "Shall we?" It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Jasmine looked at his hand, the scarred knuckles, the strong fingers. She looked at the door, and then at the people watching them. She realized she didn't care about their judgment anymore. For the first time in her life, the staring eyes didn't feel like spotlights of shame. They felt like an audience witnessing her vindication. She reached out and placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, warm, and incredibly grounding. It was an anchor in the storm. As she stood up, she didn't smooth her dress. She didn't hunch her shoulders. She stood at her full height, lifting her chin. Together, they walked through the restaurant, navigating the maze of tables not as intruders, but as royalty leaving a court that was unworthy of them. The silence stretched out, unbroken by even the clink of silverware. The socialites who had whispered, the businessmen who had sneered, they all looked down at their plates, unable to meet the gaze of the couple passing by. Dae-young was still standing by the table, diminished and small, a man who had tried to wield humiliation as a weapon and found himself cut by the blade of his own cruelty. They passed him without a glance, leaving him in the wreckage of his failed prank. When the heavy oak doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the scent of truffle oil and the stifling atmosphere of the Golden Heron, the cool evening air hit their faces like a benediction. The street outside was bathed in the amber glow of city streetlights, the noise of traffic a welcome chaotic hum after the suffocating quiet of the restaurant. They walked a few paces away from the entrance before stopping. The valet stepped forward, holding the keys to Min-ho's sleek black sedan, but Min-ho shook his head. "Not yet," he said softly. He turned to Jasmine, his demeanor shifting from the fierce protector back to the man who was simply trying to figure out his own heart. The adrenaline that had sustained them inside began to ebb, replaced by a raw, vibrating intimacy. Jasmine looked up at him, the streetlights reflecting in her eyes, which were still shimmering with unshed tears. "You really meant what you said?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. About seeing me?" It was the question of a woman who had been conditioned to believe she was invisible, or worse, an eyesore. Min-ho reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with a tenderness that defied his violent reputation. "I have never meant anything more," he replied. "In my world, Jasmine, everyone wears a mask. They pretend to be brave, they pretend to be loyal. Tonight, you were the only one who was brave enough to be yourself. That is a kind of beauty that makes everything else look cheap." "I'm usually the punchline," Jasmine admitted, leaning against the stone railing that lined the sidewalk, looking out at the passing cars. "I've spent my whole life trying to shrink, trying to take up less space so people wouldn't be offended by my existence. But tonight, when you stood up," she choked back a sob, a happy one this time. "I felt like I was worth defending." Min-ho moved to stand beside her, looking out at the city skyline. "You are worth defending," he said firmly. "And you should never shrink. You should expand. You should fill every room you enter, because the world needs more of what you have." He looked at his hands, the scarred knuckles that had delivered so much pain in the past. "I have spent my life taking up space through fear. I make people small so I can feel big. Tonight, for the first time, I wanted to be big for the right reason. To protect something precious." He turned to her, a small, crooked smile touching his lips. "And I am still hungry. That foam and scallop. It was not enough." Jasmine laughed, a genuine, bell-like sound that seemed to cleanse the air between them. "I'm starving," she confessed. "I was too nervous to eat all day." Minho offered his arm, a gentlemanly gesture that felt entirely natural now. "I know a place," he said. "It is not 5 stars. There are no chandeliers. But the grandmother who runs it makes a kimchi stew that will heal your soul." Jasmine took his arm, feeling the solid muscle beneath the expensive suit fabric. "That sounds perfect," she said. They began to walk down the city street, away from the district of high-end pretension and toward the vibrant, beating heart of the city. As they walked, the distance between them closed. They weren't just a mafia boss and a nurse anymore. They were 2 souls who had found a strange, unexpected refuge in each other. Minho asked her about her work, about the kids she helped, listening with a rapt attention that made Jasmine feel like the most interesting person in the world. In turn, she asked him about his tattoos, not with judgment, but with curiosity about the stories they told. They ended up at a small, open-air tent stall tucked into an alleyway, steam rising from large metal pots into the night air. The plastic stools were wobbly, and the lighting came from a single bare bulb, but to Jasmine, it felt like a palace. The old woman running the stall scolded Minho for being too thin and ladled out massive bowls of spicy, red stew, ignoring his suit and treating him like a wayward grandson. Jasmine watched him eat, stripped of the pretense, stripped of the need to be the terrifying boss. He was just a man enjoying a hot meal. She realized then that the beast the world saw was just a costume he wore for survival, much like the beige dress was hers. They sat there for hours, long after the bowls were empty, talking about everything and nothing. Jasmine told him about her dream of opening a clinic for underprivileged kids. Minho told her about his secret love for classical music, a passion he hid from his men because it wasn't tough. As the night deepened and the city noises quieted, a comfortable silence settled over them. It wasn't the awkward silence of the blind date's beginning, nor the tense silence of the confrontation. It was the companionable silence of 2 people who no longer needed to hide. Minho looked at Jasmine, the harsh fluorescent light of the stall softening her features. He realized that the prank his men had pulled, the cruel joke intended to mock him, had backfired in the most magnificent way. They had tried to anchor him with a weight, but instead, they had given him a balloon. They had given him a way out of the darkness he had been drowning in. "They thought they were punishing me," Minho said quietly, breaking the silence. "They thought that by sitting me next to you, they would lower my status." He reached across the small, sticky table and took her hand again. "They didn't realize they were giving me a gift. They were giving me the chance to see what real strength looks like." Jasmine squeezed his hand back. "And they thought they were humiliating me," she whispered. "They thought I would run away and cry. But instead, I found someone who sees me." She looked into his dark eyes, seeing the vulnerability he kept hidden from the world. "I think," she said slowly, "that maybe we saved each other tonight." Minho nodded, his expression solemn. "I think you are right." He stood up, dropping a generous amount of cash on the table for the old woman, who bowed profusely. "Come," he said. "Let me take you home. Properly this time. No running." They walked back toward the main street, the city asleep around them. The night had started with cruelty and judgment, fueled by the superficial standards of a society obsessed with appearances. It had been designed to break a woman for her size and a man for his pride. But as they walked side by side, their shadows merging into one under the streetlights, it was clear that the night had ended in victory. They had found something rare in the wreckage of that dinner. They had found the truth that beauty isn't found in the cut of a dress or the number on a scale. nor is strength found in the fear you inspire in others. True beauty is the courage to be vulnerable, and true strength is the willingness to stand up for dignity, even when the whole room is laughing. As Minho opened the car door for Jasmine, he didn't care about what his lieutenants would say the next morning. He didn't care about the whispers in the underworld. He knew that he had found something real, something solid, in a world of smoke and mirrors. And as Jasmine slid into the seat, she didn't worry about whether she fit. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she belonged exactly where she was. The blind date was over, but their story, a story of unexpected kindness and the redemption of two lonely hearts, was just beginning.